Welcome to Defining Dad Bod, where we work to untangle the messy knots of the health and fitness industry as if your children's lives depended on it. Because they do. This is where we decide to make our bodies stand for something bigger than ourselves. This is where we find practical wisdom to live by, one powerful conversation at a time. May the words spoken here inspire you to keep moving forward no matter where you are. Who knows who you could be if you could become 1% better every single day.
We can do the show thanks to the support of listeners just like you. For more information how you can become part of the inner circle, go to findingdadbod.com/inner circle.
What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing super well. Welcome to part 8B of the Trufit Series. Sorry to be confusing. There was just too much to cover with carbohydrates to pack that all into one episode. Like us only being able to metabolize about 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, I'm sure there's a limit to how much nerdiness can permeate into your brain from a podcast every hour. So in this episode, we'll be continuing our conversation about carbohydrates, specifically why carbs get a bad rap, and then how do we practically apply these things in our individual lives, and then some pro tips about how we coach our clients here at Defining Dad Bod with them. I want to say a huge thank you to those of you who have taken me up on the offer to trade a raving review on iTunes for a free touch-base call on your health and fitness. That offer still stands through the month of February, which, because it's leap year, you have one extra day than most Februaries. You could jump on like Jared and say, top-notch insights, 5 stars. Alex has a lot to offer. Not a fan of gimmicky crash diets or fad supplements, Alex consistently and concisely lays down well-reasoned and proven strategies for improving your fitness, all while being engaging to listen to. This is a great podcast for anyone who wants to take better care of their body. Keep up the great work. Man, I appreciate that. And if you want to take the time to leave us a raving review, I would appreciate you too. You just open the iTunes app, scroll all the way down, and click Leave a Review. If you think highly of what we're doing here, then your positive review helps us to appear higher on the iTunes charts. So when people search things like carbohydrates, fat loss, weight training, dad bod, then Defining Dad Bod is the one that's recommended most quickly. And after you do that, if you get a hold of me on social media or shoot me an email at coachal@definingdadbod.com, I'll send you a link to my calendar and we can hop on the phone to have a great conversation about you and your personal health and fitness journey. No strings, you don't have to buy coaching. I just want to be able to trade my time and expertise as a thank you for reviewing us positively in iTunes. Also note that if you're interested in getting in some kind of special shape for the summer, now is the time that smart people get started. I can't tell you how many people reach out to me in May trying to get their six-pack by their June vacation, and me having to tell them that I don't have a magic wand to wave. So if I can be helpful in that, review us positively and reach out to me before February ends, and we'll get you that calendar link. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to tie up this carbohydrate conversation so that we can move on to fats and proteins. Here we go. So here in 2020 in the health and fitness industry, carbs get a bad rap. Why is that? There are a lot of reasons carbs get a bad rap. Let's walk through them together. The first and most important reason, in my opinion, that carbohydrates get a bad rap is because the huge abundance of ultra-processed foods in the standard American diet. As the world becomes more and more industrialized, and people come to expect their food to cost less and less while being more and more convenient, you find that the vast majority of food available for purchase in somewhere like a grocery store or even a convenience store is going to be an ultra-processed, prepackaged food. What does this have to do with carbohydrates? Well, do you remember when we were talking about the size of the carbohydrate molecule? How a polysaccharide, a large molecule of carbohydrate, is made up of much smaller pieces, like chain links making up a chain. When you make a Twinkie or a potato chip, and you expose the starches of the founding materials, like ground up wheat in the case of Twinkies, or thinly sliced potatoes in the case of potato chips. When you expose those starches, those carbohydrates, to very high levels of heat for an extended period of time, and several different chemical processes and ingredients that increase the shelf life of those foods, by default, what happens is you take the very long chain polysaccharides that are in the food itself and chop it up into much smaller pieces. Hey, what does it matter, Alex? Carbs are carbs. They're all going to turn into glucose, right? Well, yes, on one hand, you're right. But on the other hand, the question is, how quickly do ultra-processed foods turn into the sugar that gets into our bloodstream. And it turns out that ultra-processed foods significantly increase the glycemic index of the food substance that it was made out of. For instance, a piece of whole wheat toast has a very different glycemic index than ultra-processed baking flour. So the fundamental building blocks of a Twinkie and a piece of whole wheat toast are exactly the same thing. The carbohydrates in one hit us much differently at the level of the gut and the bloodstream than the other. And so right now in the nutrition sciences, when we're looking at things like carb to fat ratios and protein ratios and tracking positive health and positive body composition outcomes for patients and subjects, what we find is often those studies treat all carbohydrates as if they're created equal. The grams of carbohydrates coming from your Skittles and Twinkies holding roughly the same value numerically as the grams of carbohydrates coming from your wheat toast. We'll talk more about carbohydrate periodization in a little bit, but one of the ways that we overcome the misconceptions about carbohydrates as a whole is the same way that we overcome the misconceptions about calories as a whole. Not all carbs are created equal, and similarly, not all calories are created equal. In addition to the vast amounts of ultra-processed carbohydrates that you can find available at your grocery store, convenience store, or even fast food joints, you'll also note that many of those ultra-processed products also have a significant amount of simple sugars and even low-quality fats added to the product itself. And so you can get foods like Twinkies, which I'll keep picking on, that in a relatively small volume of the food, one Twinkie equaling about 130 calories, you can pack 24 grams of carbohydrates, 5 grams of fat, and about half a gram of protein into that tiny little thing, whereas a normal yellow squash cooked in a little bit of butter would be about 10 grams of carbohydrates, 4 grams of fat, and 1 gram of protein. Not only is there a significant caloric difference between the ultra-processed Twinkie and the minimally processed yellow squash, the carbohydrate composition is different. Because the Twinkie's ultra-processed, those carbohydrates break down quickly and easily and end up in your bloodstream much faster. Whereas the carbohydrates from your squash take a much longer time to break down because they're longer chain. And in fact, some of those starches might actually make it to the large intestine, where it can feed some good bacteria, some healthy starches, rather than passing undigested sugar onto your large intestine, feeding the toxic gas-producing microbiota that ultra-processed foods tend to feed. So while you're considering carbohydrates in your diet, don't lump your fruits and veggies in with your ultra-processed foods. Another reason carbs get a bad rap is that a lack of exercise and proper conditioning of the body leads to all sorts of issues with carbohydrate regulation. I call it the chocolate milk problem, and I cover this in full in episode 117 of Defining Dad Bod if you're interested. The take-home message is, if you are athletically conditioned, it's very likely that not only are you insulin sensitive enough to handle sugar, but you're also regularly using your glycogen stores. And so your capacity to consume carbohydrates without any negative health or body composition effects is much higher than the average person. Carbs often get a bad rap because somebody just starting a weight loss journey or a workout program might try to feed themselves like an athlete is recommended to feed themselves. And that's not going to work out very well for you. If you're not using your glycogen stores well, you're not burning fat well as a fuel source, and you're a bit insulin resistant. Like I said, if you want to hear more about that, go to episode 117, where I tackle the sugar problem. Another reason carbs get a bad rap is related to the same issue. That is, the cortisol and insulin dysregulation that's related to weight gain and a sedentary lifestyle. Remember when we talked about carbohydrates hitting the bloodstream? When we talked about the amount of glucose in the bloodstream going up, what I saved till now to talk about is the relationship between the hormone insulin, which is produced by your pancreas, and the hormone cortisol, which is produced by your adrenal glands. Insulin does a number of things in the body, but one of its most important functions is to signal fat cells to tell them whether or not to keep releasing fat to be used as fuel, or to turn off fat burn altogether. It also signals other cells in the body, like muscle cells, organ cells, and even nervous system cells, to use sugar as a fuel source when there's large amounts of sugar available in the bloodstream. And so if you couple a sedentary lifestyle, which is a lifestyle that's not using carbohydrates very often in the form of intense exercise, and therefore finds people with large amounts of glycogen, so your carbs really have nowhere to go but into your fat storage, and you add a few pounds to somebody so that there's more cells inside of them to respond to insulin, then the body protects itself from diabetic shock by automatically desensitizing the cells in your body to insulin itself. And so carbs get a bad rap because when somebody has more weight on them than they should, and they're not exercising regularly like they could, then they find themselves in a downward spiral of increasing insulin resistance an increasing dependence on carbohydrates to be burned as fuel in the body. I know that's a lot to take in. If you want to get deeper into those subjects, then check out episode 30 where I speak specifically about insulin's job in the body, and episode 40 where I speak specifically about cortisol and its relationship to insulin. Carbs wouldn't get such a bad rap if people understood how activity and a healthy body composition allow the body to use both carbohydrates and fats as fuel sources, even without following a quote low-carb diet. Another thing we can't go without saying here is that carbs often get a bad rap because it's the only macronutrient that human beings can technically live without. If a person goes without protein for too long, their body's unable to find any other way to do the job that protein's supposed to do in the body. The same thing happens to be true of fats in the body. If a person was to cut out fat completely from their diet, there are a number of systems and processes that would suffer so badly that they would be unable to keep living unless they added fats back in. But that's not the case with carbohydrates. From a biological perspective, carbohydrates lend specifically energy to the body. And it turns out that both fats and proteins can be utilized as energy in the body in place of carbohydrates if they're not available. There's a process called ketogenesis, wherein the body can utilize ketones instead of carbohydrates to power those reactions we talked about in the mitochondria. And so without carbohydrates, fats can stand in just fine on the energy side of things. And similarly, if it's necessary at a biological level, the body can also turn amino acids into glucose using a process called gluconeogenesis. Some very passionate, and I'm sure well-meaning individuals have thus suggested that carbohydrates are completely unnecessary. And since human beings are capable of subsisting on the modern-day equivalent of whale blubber and steak, then that's what everybody should be doing. And while a debate on how omnivorous human beings were in the past, and perhaps should be now in the present, would be a lot of fun, this isn't the place for it. For now, I just want you to know that this is one of the reasons that carbs get a bad rap. Technically, you don't need them to survive. Whether or not that means you never get another piece of carrot cake in order to manifest your best in this life, in my mind, that's a completely different question. For my part, unless you've got a medical issue that requires that you cut out carbohydrates completely, I'm going to say that surviving is not quite the same thing as thriving. And we'll leave it at that at the moment. Hang with me. I've got just a few more reasons why carbs get a bad rap that I think are really important. Kind of riding on the coattails of the idea that we can technically live without carbohydrates. If you dive into the meta-analysis done on carbohydrates and fats and positive outcomes for patients, clients, and subjects in research, then what you find is we really don't know what the optimal ratios of carbs, fats, and proteins are in somebody's day for positive body composition outcomes, performance outcomes, or health outcomes. I covered a very specific and comprehensive article in episode 93 of Defining Dad Bod. It's titled, Should You Eat Less Carbs or Not? The Science of the Great Carbs versus Fats Debate, and what we do and don't know in the scientific community about how many carbs you should be eating versus how many fats you should be eating would surprise you. I'd encourage you to go check that out. The last two reasons I believe carbs get a bad rap in my purview is a lack of understanding around 1, genetics and epigenetics, and 2, our microbiome. In episode 126 of Defining Dad Bod, part 4 of the Trufit Series, I did my best to explain epigenetics well. And the idea of different genetic heritages requiring different nutrient profiles is also something I've brought up multiple times in the show. Long story short, it's very likely that some people do much better than other people on a relatively high carbohydrate diet, while there are other people who do much better in their lives with a relatively low carbohydrate diet. Our genetic makeup can influence our insulin sensitivity. It can influence how we break down carbohydrates and the different enzymes we produce in differing amounts. It can influence the muscle fibers that we have on our body and what types burn fat primarily as a fuel source versus carbs primarily as a fuel source, and how much of it we have on us. And genetic factors also influence personality traits that could be involved in the regulation of things like serotonin and dopamine, as we spoke about before. Until these interactions are well mapped out, I wish I could tell you more specifically what alleles, genetically speaking, predispose people to do better with more carbohydrates or worse with more carbohydrates. But unfortunately, that science is murky at best. But we all understand anecdotally that we have that one friend that seems to be able to eat however much pizza they want and never gain a pound. While we have that other friend, and maybe it's us, that just looks at a cupcake and then stores it on their love handles. I know, it's not quite fair, but I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you like it is. And so that brings me to our microbiome, which the more I learn about it, the more fascinated and interested I become. Basically, all of the food that you eat passes through your digestive system and is not only broken down by the enzymes and the mechanical processes that go on in your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, and your small and large intestines, but that food is also processed or broken down by billions and billions of bacterial colonies that live inside of you. It turns out that different bacterial colonies are more efficient than other bacterial colonies at breaking down carbohydrates. Additionally, some byproducts of the bacterial colonies we feed could have negative repercussions on our neurotransmitters in our brain and perhaps even insulin sensitivity. What I'm telling you is that one of the reasons carbs get a bad rap is because when we lump them all together under carbohydrates, we miss out on the differentiation of how certain carbohydrate sources are feeding our bacterial colonies well and causing positive repercussions over time, whereas some of those sources of carbohydrates that we simply call carbs are influencing our gut bacteria in a bad way and causing negative repercussions on our body over time. And it's not just all the processed crap either. For most everybody else, black beans would be a very powerful nutrient source. However, in some individuals with certain bacterial colonies, the fiber in black beans is metabolized to create large amounts of hydrogen sulfide gas, which is not only embarrassing when it comes out the other side, #rotten egg gas, but hydrogen sulfide gas can also be damaging to the gut lining itself, which over time can cause inflammatory issues and even permanent damage. Am I saying you shouldn't eat black beans? No, not really, although I know I shouldn't. But what I am saying is carbs get a very bad rap because we don't understand our microbiome as well as we should, and we lump all carbohydrates into the same category, simply labeled carbs, when the carbs from oatmeal, the carbs from black beans, the carbs from a green banana versus a banana with some brown spots on it, they all have vastly different effects on the microbiome of our body. And as a population, we simply know next to nothing about it. With all that being said, I'm sure you're gathering by now that I'm not one of your anti-carbohydrate zealots. However, carbohydrates enter my conversations very often with my clients, both because of these misconceptions and because of the importance of coaching these intelligently in order to bring about long-term body composition change. So how do we handle all these factors at Defining Dad Bod? Well, there's a number of things we do, and I hope this is really helpful to you, so listen close. First, from a training perspective, we like to periodize our carbohydrates. Periodize sounds like a fancy word. What it really means is that there are phases of training that require lower carbohydrate intake to get more positive adaptations, and other phases of training that require higher carbohydrate intake in order to get the best positive adaptations out of ourselves. I've referenced this concept often when I talk about training acute variables, and when I talk about preparing for the holidays intelligently. Basically, during the foundations and endurance phases of training, I often recommend clients to have a lower carbohydrate intake. Depending on the person, 20 to 40% of their calories in a day coming from carbohydrates is usually fantastic. Also, as I've alluded to earlier, the sources of carbohydrates are extremely important. Generally, we focus on those long-chain polysaccharides, good resistant starches, and some solid fiber sources to keep the carbohydrates that are in our life nice and low on the glycemic index and supporting a healthy gut at the same time. Oh man, I can hear you saying, 20 to 40% of my calories from carbohydrates? That leaves no room for Oreos. No, it really doesn't. And honestly, if you're going to look for a dirty source of carbohydrates, pick something better than Oreos, man. #peach cobbler for life. But it's not all gloom and doom. In the higher intensity phases of training, like hypertrophy, strength, and athleticism, consumption of carbohydrates is often better, higher. For many of my clients, this means somewhere between 40 and 60, sometimes 70% of their calories coming from carbohydrates. And we even strategize how a high carbohydrate, perhaps even processed carbohydrate meal will do better on our high volume, high intensity days. This is where you've heard me say, if you're going to have carrot cake, have it on leg day. I could be more specific and say, if you're going to have carrot cake, make sure it's on leg day in the hypertrophy, strength, or athleticism phase. This periodized carbohydrate intake profile is extremely important to me as a fitness professional for two reasons. One, there is a small body of evidence around metabolic flexibility that suggests if you cut carbohydrates completely out of your life, then you start to lose your ability to metabolize them well. This might be one of the problems with people who go low carb for a period of time to try to hit their weight loss goal. And then when they're happy with the weight that they've hit, they try to add those things back in. Well, losing weight by cutting calories and carbohydrates does not make you any better at processing carbohydrates. It just forces you not to use them as a fuel for a while. And then when you add them back in, your body doesn't know what to do with them. and so it stores them again. And that might be a gross oversimplification of the science, but there you have it. The second reason it's important to me as a coach to periodize carbohydrates, I know this for myself, clients are much happier when they don't have to limit carbohydrates all the time. I speak often on this show about balancing the quality of your life and the quantity of your life. And frankly, it's nice that there are some phases of training that I can put my body through that makes a French toast date with my son on a Friday morning a positive thing in my training cycle, rather than a negative thing in my training cycle. In short, periodizing carbohydrates is based on the philosophy, don't avoid carbs, earn them. So when you're exercising at a low intensity, in the lower intensity phases of training, your body will do just fine running off of mostly fat as a fuel source. But in the higher intensity phases of training, when you're actually using carbohydrates regularly, having built a solid foundation for yourself in the lower intensity phases of training, then you are regularly earning carbohydrates in your day. And when you eat them, especially from high quality sources, your body's going to use them well. And this periodized carbohydrate profile is related to the next thing we do in coaching, which is planning our, quote, cheat meals. Now, I'll probably do a show on cheat meals altogether, all by itself. Technically, I hate the word cheat. The reason is that I generally help people plan their, quote, cheat meals. And so if you make those things a part of the plan, then it's not a cheat. But I would advise you that even if you're not working with a coach, if you know you're going on a date with your wife, and it's going to be a particularly high calorie, likely molten chocolate cake sort of meal, then make sure your workout program coincides with some sort of high-intensity interval training, or large muscle groups like quads, hamstrings, and glutes, or lats, lower traps, so that the load of your workout program, 1, depletes your glycogen stores, and 2, primes your body for the anabolic effect of the workout itself. Carbs can actually enhance the adaptations that come from a high-intensity exercise program, and so you'll be making great use of that fuel, rather than just cheating on your diet in a way that was kind of factored into the caloric need of the week. Also, you get to walk away feeling like a winner who had a great workout that day and hopefully a great date. The last thing we navigate in coaching here at Defining Dad Bod is probably one of the things that sets us very apart from other coaching programs, and that is the development of other emotional regulation strategies that are not food related, that'll help our clients get off of carbohydrates as a serotonin and dopamine modulator. Again, maybe this is worth a show all by itself, but things like periodized exercise, gratitude, goal, or anxiety journaling, fasting, prayer and meditation, music, and even intentional communication in relationships can all be powerful skills that you could develop to manage your emotional regulation of dopamine and serotonin better. I've heard clients say things like, I don't know why I did that. I wasn't even hungry, but I felt sort of like I was rewarding myself for a really hard day. Or, I don't know what to tell you, Alex, but even after a 1,000 calorie dinner, I still feel hungry afterward. But I notice it's not in my stomach, it's in my head. And I believe this sort of thing, in the year 2020, is an extremely important component of somebody's nutrition and exercise program. It's one thing to have a meal plan. It's another thing to have food journaling expectations and to work on habits. But it's something completely different to begin bringing awareness to how often we're regulating our own emotions with the food that we eat. And since there's no shortage of ultra-processed carbohydrate stuff for us to drown our sorrows in, I believe it's important for modern-day people to develop the skills to regulate their own emotions outside of food. And those skills allow us to make intelligent decisions about periodizing carbohydrates, our carbohydrate sources, and enjoying some of the pleasures of life every once in a while, like cake on your birthday. I think that about wraps up the carbohydrate conversation. I'm looking forward to covering fats and proteins with you soon, and after a few more fantastic topics, we'll tie a bow on this Trufit series. If this episode, or the episode before, have generated some questions for you, make sure you drop those in the Defining Dad Bod Inner Circle, and I'll field those for you live at the end of the month. This has been Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The free, practical advice and conversations here remain unbought and unbiased thanks to the support of listeners just like you. If this episode's been helpful to you, please share it with somebody in your life who you know it will benefit. Then, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a raving review to tell others what value Defining Dad Bod has brought to your health and fitness journey. And finally, if you want more Defining Dad Bod, consider joining our online community. We send a lot of free perks and resources your way, and I, Coach Alex, go live every month to talk through our listeners' health and fitness questions to make the practical science of this show applicable to everyday life. Everyone's welcome, and we'd love to have you. For more information about joining the Inner Circle or becoming a supporter of the Defining Dad Bod podcast, go to definingdadbod.com/inner circle. That's definingdadbod.com/inner circle.